We're going to start back up again, and we next on the agenda is a discussion, so I will tee up the kind of general information and then turn it over to Ms. Golden first and then David Wagner to weigh in as well. As part of your all's recommendations or encouragement to us at a prior meeting, and I think as a result of my own on-the-spot idea making, the EAC hosted a meeting of accessibility, so voters with disabilities and accessibility experts, including Diane and others, security experts, including, I think, David, you participated via phone, but was part of the meeting, as well as some other computer scientists from across the country, and election officials. And the purpose of the meeting, as we talked about at the last TGDC meeting, was to tackle this idea and challenges of the need and requirements for accessibility, that voters can not only cast their votes freely and independently, but verify and have the auditing process done in an accessible manner, and the desire and goals of the security community to have fully transparent, verifiable, and auditable systems. And so the purpose, and it was moderated and facilitated by David Becker, who did a very good job feeding the conversation in a direction to where are we, how can we ensure both goals, because they're not mutually exclusive. A voting system needs to be both accessible and verifiable and audible or secure. And so the goal of the conversation was to have that and see where there's agreement. And so I guess I'll turn it over to Diane for her takeaways, and then David, and then others can weigh in, and I'm happy to share my experience. But I wanted to share the results of that conversation because I think it speaks directly to where we are currently in the principles and guidelines and some of the tougher issues, or the toughest issues. So, Diane.
Sure. And I just jotted down a few notes. Much of the conversation, quite frankly, was repeat of conversations we've been having for over a decade now, with the return to what I'll just refer to as a core paper ballot, as the determinative vote record rather than a digital ballot, quote unquote. It's very clear that paper's inaccessible in and of itself, and so making it accessible is a challenge. And we've done a reasonably sort of good job providing a digital interface for people who need access features so that they can mark a paper ballot, actually generate the print on a ballot. But where we have fallen down over and over and over again is allowing a voter to verify that printed marked paper ballot accessibly, and then casting that printed paper ballot accessibly. And providing access for verification and casting is very difficult and expensive and complex, and just hasn't been done, quite frankly, because there's not a market demand, and anyway, a variety of factors. So that's been the historic challenge. And as we discussed, from the security side, and I will certainly let David Wagner speak to that, you know, one of the, I think, classic statements from the security audibility side was, well, if you assume a core paper ballot, then all these other things fall into place. And I said, excuse me, but if you assume a digital ballot, all of my accessibility issues fall into place. So this is the inherent tug here. Quite frankly, in order to be accessible, it has to be digital. You can't make paper accessible otherwise. It has to be digital at some point to be accessible. So we just have this balancing act, tug of war going back and forth. And, you know, there's a resolution we'll discuss later at some time, but, and I wasn't joking about, you know, my comment about I'd like to see this before I die. I really would like to see an actually deployed system that works and works efficiently and is cost effective from an election official's perspective. I mean, my gut fear is we can do this. We have the technology, we can do it, but can we do it in a way that any of you guys can implement and make it work efficiently and effectively? That I don't know, because I haven't seen it happen. So anyway, we had a good discussion, and I mean, our working group has, you know, we can put the standards together, whether or not we actually get a system deployed that meets them, that works efficiently and effectively in an actual voting environment, is kind of the unknown of this equation. So,
David, anything you want to add?
Sure, David Wagner. Yeah, that was a good summary. I'll add a little more. I was there for most, but not all of it. I had to step out for an hour or two to teach, so I hope folks here will correct me if I misrepresent anything that happened at the meeting. I believe the goal of the meeting was to try to figure out how to handle the tension between accessibility and security or auditability, how to find a way forward that could meet the needs of both of those communities and goals. And I think the workshop was successful at that, in identifying a path forward that looked plausible, that it sounded like meet accessibility concerns, and that looked like from the security and auditability perspective could meet the security and auditability perspective. So I thought that was very encouraging. The challenge that we continually have faced, as Diane mentioned, we've had this conversation over and over, is around paper. That what the security folks have, what we've heard from that community and from the research there, is that if it's not auditable, it's not secure. And to make it auditable, that requires some way to check the system. There's been a proposed concept called software independence. And the challenge with that is that right now, if you look at the systems that are on the market that are currently available, the only current way of achieving that involves some kind of a paper trail, paper ballot, paper trail, which then introduces all of the accessibility challenges that Diane raised, including especially transport of the paper ballot. We heard from some of the cryptographers and computer security folks. They're speaking in favor of software independence. Some of them spoke in favor of a paper trail. Others advocated for a different angle towards software independence. They proposed cryptographic end-to-end voting systems, which are an alternative means of meeting software independence and providing auditability that may or may not involve paper. I think the advocates imagine at least the initial implementations might possibly involve paper, but that don't need to, and that could provide a path forward to a system that doesn't involve paper and is instead relying on some fairly sophisticated mathematics and cryptography. And there was a debate among the security community about, which of those is the better angle, what's achievable, are the cryptographic end-to-end systems plausibly implementable, could they reach the market? There's currently no systems, I think, that are of that form.
Are they FIPS certified?
Yeah, this cryptography is specialized for the voting environment, so we would need to develop our own standards to support that. FIPS wasn't really developed with voting in mind, is developed for some rather different algorithms, so you're getting at a challenge there. So I think what the security community take away from that was, let's not try to push one or the other of these angles. The proposal was to require auditability in the form of software independence, which could then be met either by paper or by cryptographic end-to-end systems. From on the accessibility side, require that whatever the system is, that it must be accessible. So I think the outcome of that meeting, the path forward, was a dual requirement for accessibility no matter what, and for software independence, with two possible ways towards achieving software independence. So the implications for us in the cybersecurity working group, I think that we have a pretty good idea how to write requirements for paper-based systems. For the cryptographic end-to-end systems, that's going to be a bunch more work for us, and we're not there yet. And that's going to be particularly challenging because we don't have existing systems on the market. So we're writing requirements for envisioned future systems rather than for systems that are currently deployed or available on the market.
I think both of those are perfect summaries of where the discussion ended, and it is reflected in the current principles and guidelines that you have in your folders. There was a recognition that there was a commitment in the principles and guidelines to be technologically neutral, and therefore that the software independence requirement had to be viewed as such, that it could not be a dictate of a certain specific type of technology, but instead a principle to be followed with the requirements to follow in kind, and that any form of software independence had to offer full, independent, not only ballot casting, as we said, but verification and auditability as such. And Diane, I think, made a very cogent point about why verification from a paper standpoint for voters with disabilities is such a challenge. And there was a recognition that the technology does exist to provide that level of accessibility, and that, in fact, it's incumbent now on the marketplace to utilize that technology, and that we've come a long way since the discussions of the 2007 VVSG technologically to tackle these. And there was an absolute unanimous agreement that full accessibility must be present, that was not something to be capitulated on from all, I think, in the room. So are there any questions about that meeting, the reflection in the draft principles and guidelines? But we wanted to make sure we discussed it because it was something we committed to doing at the prior meeting and fulfilled. Awesome. You guys, both of you, David and Diane, I want to thank you both for your participation, for sharing the comments. I will say, Diane probably didn't feel as optimistic. I felt really good about where we walked out of that meeting at, that there was a recognition on both sides of the importance of their points, and that it wasn't one has to give for another, but in fact both have to be present. And I think both sides really shared that, and the election officials in the room certainly appreciated that, because they're the ones that have to deploy this and would face lawsuits, I think, in both directions and otherwise. So I think, generally speaking, in the room there was absolute recognition of it. Neil.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to go back on, but I do have a question, actually. I'm wondering, out of the meeting, if there was any discussion or where it fit into the meeting, an online marking device for accessibility with a paper printout. How did that, was there discussion on that?
Yeah, so to my recollection, there was, and one of the conversations that was had was for voters with disabilities, that if there's this software independence principle present, that it increased the flexibility for the types of technologies folks could use to mark their ballot, right? And so there was a conversation around it, that additional flexibility for voters with disabilities, particularly to use their own technology in a variety of ways, which may include online ballot marking, but that as long as you, in the end, had this verifiable, auditable record, that it created that flexibility. And please correct me if I'm misstating the conversation, but.
Yeah, the challenge with online ballot marking devices is, in order to provide accessible verification, and casting is really a challenge, but I'll kind of set that aside. Person really almost has to have their own AT. I mean, because you're talking about an OCR scanning. I mean, that's the only way you can really, if you're asking a voter remotely to print, then somehow they got to scan that print back in, and that means they're going to probably have to have their own assistive tech, to do that. And that creates kind of another set of issues, concerns for people about folks using their own technology. And anyway, so there's potentially a number of issues. But yeah, for me, remote voting, letting somebody use their own assistive technology is kind of the best option, because you eliminate all kinds of issues, training and experience and knowledge and expertise of using your own, assistive technology makes things so much easier. So anyway, yeah, it's not yeah.
Other questions? Okay. Well, the good news is we're a little ahead of schedule, and I appreciate you all indulging that conversation, but we wanted to make sure we were responsive to the prior meeting. So I think we can tee up the discussion, the beginnings of the discussions on the overview of the draft principles and guidelines, and at least begin that. Is that all right?
there's an awful lot to tee up. We were just going to go right into the discussion of the draft principles and guidelines.
Yeah, perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, well,
Do you need to get your folks?
I do. We kicked them out of the room.
Yeah. So we'll grab the NIST folks. Who's first?
Sharon.
Sharon. All right. So this next portion of the meeting, what we'll do is, in theory, they're watching, so they'll know in the breakout room. The next portion of the discussion is that the NIST staff will walk through what the principles and guidelines say, what the motivations behind each one of the principles and guidelines were, answer questions, concerns, comments on them, with the goal of working through whatever concerns you may have heading into tomorrow and possible approval of the principles and guidelines. So now's a good time to have an open discussion about any concerns you've had as you've looked through them, to ask questions of the NIST staff that have worked with the working groups and EAC staff that have worked with the working groups to be able to fully vet the principles and guidelines with you all heading into tomorrow. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sharon Liskowski to tee up the first set of principles and guidelines, which will be on accessibility and usability. Sharon, the table's yours.
Well, I believe Matt just did the intro.
You're up.
So you're up.
And again, this is meant to be interactive for you all. So as she goes, as you have questions, or if you want to wait till the end, the idea is for you all to be able to cover questions, concerns, whatnot, as we walk through the human factors, principles, and guidelines.
There we go. Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking primarily about the human factors, principles, and guidelines. Let's put it in slide mod. Well, technical detail. There we go. Oh. Thank you. Okay, there's basically 4 principles. Equivalent and consistent voter access, marked, verified, and cast as intended, robust, safe, usable, and accessible, and voter privacy. I'm going to be going over in detail each of these with their associated guidelines. And there's also, let me take this opportunity to talk about when we, the NIST team, took our stovepiped principles from security, interoperability, high quality design and implementation, and put them together into the 15 that you see now. We saw there were overlaps, and we realized we needed to kind of look at the whole, because all 15 principles stand together and work together. So this final version is a result of that collaboration across the team. So first, let me quickly go over the changes from the VVSG 1.1. So what's new with this approach to high-level principles and guidelines is that we can clearly state high-level goals of accessibility and usability for all voters. We envision this in a way that these can be applied to any interactive system or function that's in the voting system scope. And we hope and believe that as technology emerges, that we're generic enough that you don't really have to change. At this level, it's the underlying requirements that change if there's some specific implementation details relevant, that's relevant to that technology. And the way we developed our principles and guidelines is an extensive gap analysis and review of the research and sort of how do these group together, and then we drilled back down to identify where there were gaps in requirements. So as a result of this process, we actually do have a skeleton set of requirements underneath them. We also felt it was important to reference federal accessibility standards to make sure that that systems meet accessibility requirements as required by law. So we wanted to say that generically because versions of standards underneath change, they get updated. But this ensures that we always refer to commonly acceptable standards. We also wanted to be sure to include accessible processes for verification, including voter verifiable paper records, as you just heard earlier from Diane and David. We organized also according to what are called the POUR principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. That comes out of the accessibility community and standards such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are now part of the updated Section 508. We also wanted to make sure we support universal design and usability. That is, trying to identify the largest range of voters while balancing minimizing the voter interface complexity, especially at the polling place. And we added, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail later, making sure our user-centered design methodology is applied up front in the development process, and also kind of a higher level transparency principle that John Wack is going to talk about later in the day, that the systems and processes are easy to understand. That creates trust. That's kind of a meta usability, accessibility, human factors thing that looks at the higher level processes. So it's not a direct, here's very specific user interface requirements kind of thing. I'm not going to go over in detail this slide, but for those of you that remember, say, seeing an earlier version from February 2017, we did some shuffling, but everything that was in the February 2017 is still in here. It's just shuffled and reworded for clarity. What was new is calling out voter privacy and ballot secrecy explicitly and developing a working definition for that. And I also mentioned the user-centered design methods added to the high-quality implementation and the transparency. So the first principle is equivalent and consistent voter access. The wording is all voters can access and use the voting system regardless of their abilities without discrimination. So what are the two guidelines associated with that? Well, that voters have a consistent experience throughout the voting process in all modes of voting. So there's two levels of which this can be interpreted. At one level, if the voter needs to use audio, that audio experience is consistent throughout the process of voting, and including, for example, the verification of the ballot and the ballot choices, that is. But also, you want voters to have a consistent experience in their voting process at the meta level, that is, if they're going and using their own assistive technology to mark their ballot at home, as opposed to the polling place, that experience should be as similar as possible and consistent across the board. And the second guideline is voters receive equivalent information and options in all modes of voting. That's a basic accessibility requirement. That is, you want the same information, the same kind of options. We use the word equivalent here, not the same, because, for example, to use audio again, there may be instructions for navigation that are slightly different but equivalent. And the voting information is audio, so it's equivalent information, and that's a term of art in the accessibility community as well. The next principle is marked, verified, and cast as intended. That is, ballots and vote selections are presented in a clear, understandable way and can be marked and verified and cast by all voters. Here's where we see the perceivable, operable, and understandable guidelines. The robust, the R part of POUR, is in the next principle. For perceivable, you want displays working for the widest range of voters, and voters can adjust the settings to meet their needs. So, for example, requirements about font and contrast fall into play, and we know from research that all voters want large enough font, for example. Operable, voters and poll workers can use all controls accurately, and voters have direct control of all ballot changes. Here's where we talk about preventing overvotes, being able to navigate easily through the ballot, and not having the system say if you change something, let's say in particular, if you're doing, say, voting by party, the things don't get changed unexpectedly in other parts of the ballot. You always, as a voter, have direct control. And understandable, voters can understand all information as it's presented, including instructions, messages from the system, and error messages. So here we're talking about clear feedback, plain language in the error messages and in the navigation. And there's a lot of research that's gone on since VVSG 1.1 that we've pulled together to update requirements to capture this.
Sharon, before you go on,
Yes.
Yep, questions?
of the 15 higher level principles that are included in
Greg, can you use your mic? I'm sorry.
I just wasn't. It's on. Of the 15 principles and guidelines that are in here, this is the only one of the 15 where we've put something in bold all caps in front of the operable sentence. Is that necessary? It was obviously purposeful, but is it necessary?
We had a discussion, so we knew this was very important to call these out for the accessibility community, but it is not consistent, and we've gone both directions. I'd certainly like the input from this committee as to whether we need to change the format or not. We certainly can put in something about, we can work that into a sentence and wordsmith it to eliminate that. I maybe look to Diane to comment on that.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking about, poor is a term of art within the accessibility community, and so I understand, but then again, we've got perceivable, operable, and understandable, and we don't have robust capitalized anywhere, so we've kind of done poo. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it is in the next,
So-
there it is on the next slide.
Yeah, it's
but
in the
but
next
not
one, but
bold.
it's not capitalized in
Yeah.
bold, so we've kind of lost the poor anyway, so, yeah, I
mean,
think we
there's-
could probably put something in parens or something if it's really a big deal to make the formatting the same
Yeah.
across all of them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the verbiage associated with each one does capture the notion of perceivable, operable, and understandable. Maybe the solution is to just call it out in parentheses at the end of the sentence. Is that,
Well, I wouldn't even
Or
do
you'd
that.
not
We're
even
gonna
do
have,
that.
we're gonna have this 700-page glossary at the end, and it would certainly behoove us to not,
not have to define them explicitly? Yeah,
inside the document itself.
yep. We can do that.
I'll add, just for purposes of discussion, part of the reason I think that this was included in this way, or it was important to have those words in particular, was Matt McCullen, who's not here today, at a very early meeting in 2015, stressed the importance of having these concepts within the document. And so the reason it's called out specifically in this way in this document is because Matt had spoken to, and I think both Diane and Mark agreed to call these out, because these are known terms within that community, to see that those were being addressed directly in the guidelines and principles. So for whatever perspective that's worth, I recall that being part of the discussion in a prior meeting that we had, and I think what drove this kind of layout.
Mark, perhaps you have a comment?
Too bad Matt's not here, but I think you know why he's not here, don't you? Yeah. Okay. I'd rather not speak for him, but I think you capsulized it pretty well.
Neil, did you?
So I admit I'm coming to this in the ninth inning because Jed and I are both brand new members of the TGDC. So I feel a little guilty about asking these kinds of questions, but I'm over it now.
Not,
So,
yeah, not at all. Yeah, not a problem.
Under understandable in that 7.3, I really like the document in whole because it really talks about being easy for voters and individuals to understand these items. And then this is the only area where we're not using the word easily. So that's my question, because we talk about it in transparency, that it should be easy to understand. And then we come down here and we say voters can understand, as opposed to continuing that theme. And maybe it's minor, but I just thought that it's not consistent through the document. So that's what I was wondering.
So I'm sorry, just for clarity, you would like it to read voters can easily understand all information? Okay.
Just keeps it consistent.
I guess we were trying, I think just one of the reasons we didn't use the word easy is we were trying to be very specific about what is to be measured in requirements underneath it. You know, because easy is kind of, oh, you know, what does that mean? But, you know, yeah. So as we'll move on, we certainly want things to be tested with real users to make sure they can understand and can use the controls. So I think that's why we didn't have it in there, to make that point. Kind of gets overused and then loses meaning. So, Diane, I'm gonna look to you for.
Yeah, that's honestly it. It's, easily, efficiently is another one. And when you're talking about access features, sometimes they just aren't very efficient. Even if they're the best designed access feature in the world, they're still slow and cumbersome, but that's, so I think all of those kind of qualitative words are a little challenging to quantify and measure and look when you're looking at requirements and test assertions and verifying conformance. So,
Yeah, even efficiently, you can actually, if you've got a standard protocol for testing, a standard ballot, which we've done in the past for testing, you can actually measure time on average with specific sets of users and get some, which is particularly important for the accessible system, because if you've got, say, designed it so there's 300 button presses, if you're using a switch, probably not something you can expect voters with those kinds of disabilities that need that assistance to use. So.
Well, and I wasn't thinking of that in that context, so I appreciate the discussion. It's helpful.
Okay.
Just one thing to bring up on that, as they've been stating, easy can't be measured. And what we do at that point is we start moving the judgment of what is easy to the lab, because we can't write a test assertion to measure it. Well, then you start getting inconsistencies in the lab, because depending on who's testing and what their test protocol is, then suddenly every lab's doing it different, and they're giving judgment, which we are trying to do, because the labs are doing conformance, and we must give them something to conform to. So the word, it actually should go the other way, where we say it is easy, it's a can.
So where easily is used elsewhere in the document.
Not my area of expertise. We'll have to look through for that.
One is we're tracking each one of your comments, that we can revisit them once we get through each one of the sections, so we can say, is this something you all would like to see changed or not? Two is that obviously the principles and guidelines are not what's going to be taken and actually tested too, right? We talked about that this morning. The requirements and test assertions will be developed off of this. And so to the extent that easily is used somewhere else, we can make a decision whether it's appropriate to use it here or not use it in those other places this afternoon, recognizing that requirements will be following along with these. So other questions for Sharon before we move forward? Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, the next one is robust, safe, usable, and accessible. The voting system and voting processes provide a robust, safe, usable, and accessible experience for all users. So the guidelines under that are, first, the voting system, hardware, and accessories protect voters from harmful conditions. For example, you don't want the polling booth falling over or plugs, getting loose and electrocuting, or the flicker rate being such that it causes a seizure in some sensitive individuals. And so we have a lot of, by the way, we have a lot of these requirements in 1.1 already. Second, the voting system meets currently accepted federal standards for accessibility. I already talked about that. We generalized it at this level, so rather than reference, say, WCAG 2.0, specifically, that would go in the requirements underneath where we have more flexibility to change them as standards get updated. And thirdly, the voting system is measured with a wide range of representative voters and poll workers, including those with and without disabilities, for effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. This is based on an ISO definition, and as I mentioned before, this particular set of requirements are already in VVSG 1.1. We have a lot of guidance that we want to revisit in terms of how you test this. This is geared at the sort of near or end final product, where you're testing with sets of users each mode of voting. So if it's the audio mode, you test with people that need to use the audio mode in order to vote. And effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction are part of the standard ISO definition for how to measure this. This is called a summative usability test, if you want to get into, the usability, user experience lingo. And as I said, we had guidance in terms of a test protocol, what those sets of users should look like, what a test report should look like. We've got a standard medium complexity ballot on which to test, so you could actually look at error rates, look at efficiency, and voter satisfaction. So there's lots of materials there. We'd like to revisit them and package them up better, maybe with a short background to make it easier for the developers to use.
So, go ahead, you first.
Well, I was just going to add to this, and we've had quite a bit of discussion about when you try to gather up a representative group of voters with disabilities, it's a bit of a challenge. And I'm saying that with all, and that's been part of the problem. There are a whole lot of different kinds of functional limitations that you need to have represented, so having like one blind person isn't going to cut it, and one blind person does not equal a second blind person. If you happen to pick the one blind person who's really technologically savvy, you're going to get a whole different user feedback than you are, someone elderly with macular degeneration who doesn't use any technology, and is still blind. So it's just trying to provide guidance, as Sharon said, and at the same time acknowledging that it is really difficult to find the kinds of user groups that really is going to give you a good set of information about what's working, what's not, effectiveness, efficiency, satisfaction. And I can say this from experience for the work we did with one of the EAC funded grants, trying to find representative samples of people who use switch input. You're talking about gathering up a whole lot of different kinds of people with different kinds of disabilities and constituency groups, and even if you go pull a group of people with cerebral palsy, you get completely different kinds of cerebral palsy and functional limitations. It's not as easy as, opening a storefront someplace and saying, okay, a whole bunch of users come in. That's great usability testing in one sense, but it doesn't give you a really good set of feedback about access features. It's much more challenging than that. So anyway, that's part of trying to provide a little bit more guidance and help and suggestion for vendors. And I've talked to Matt about this a lot. Somehow we got to bridge the gap between the voting vendor community and the assistive technology vendor community, and just in general trying to merge this a little bit better. So anyway, hopefully we'll have some good things come out of it.
It sounds impossible, but it's not. People in the user experience accessibility community do it all the time, but I think we're also need to keep, but certainly a need for guidance to make it clear how to do that easily. But also, we're thinking about in the polling place, which kind of users are actually going to be there. If you take this broader view where you have different modes of voting, so if they can mark their ballot at home using their assistive technology, you don't need to worry about all the requirements in the in-polling place to get at these very specific kind of individuals. So if you give them different paths for voting, or if they can bring their ballot in with a barcode, they've already pre-marked it, they just submit it, you can then address, so we're trying to make the umbrella of voters that we can cover as big as possible, with the universal design in the polling place and some minimal assistive technology that covers enough folks that will use that technology, plus some alternative modes. So I think that's how to approach the problem, and I think that some guidance will help.
Yeah, two things real quick on that. One is, and I think Diane said it well, and that is because we've seen this challenge in our current testing program. This is not a new challenge to us. It's something we've talked with Diane a lot. So one of our commitments when we looked at the charter and the EAC VVSG working group is some sort of education effort behind the VVSG, that once the VVSG is approved, the EAC is going to endeavor with others to help educate on what it means and impact. This is where bridging that gap between the vendors and some of your folks would come in. And the test labs, by the way, so that we can begin to tackle the complex nature of this challenge and make the testing better and improve the systems, because the manufacturers want to do this better. I don't think it's a lack of desire. It's just it's a real challenge, as you said. So I think that'll be part of the VVSG education push on our end. The other, I want to highlight the middle bullet, the voting system meets currently accepted federal standards for accessibility, only to make the point, as we talked about the principles and guidelines versus requirements, this is one of the areas of flexibility that we give ourselves by doing this way. And one of the things you all, as a group, had told us is that you want to incorporate current standards for things and allow that to continue to be used, as opposed to being locked in to, version G and not being able to update it, right? And so this is one of the ways, this is one of the areas, I guess, that we did that, or the folks working on this did that. And that's the flexibility you get with the requirements being able to be more readily updated and reflect new standards and new technology in that way. So I wanted to highlight it because it's a good example of that.
Quick question, Sheriff. At your last point, wide range of representative voters and poll workers. At this point, the accessibility options for poll workers has been more limited than what we do for voters. Is the intent on this that the poll worker interfaces will have the same level of interface and accessibility as the voter?
That's, according to HAVA, poll workers are not included. It's the voter. I think we need to recognize that the poll worker population is an aging population, so you want good contrast, just like, for everyone, in large enough font, et cetera. But we don't envision writing requirements for the kind of accessibility, only, So universal design. So for example, if there's an error message that comes up that the poll worker needs to read, it needs to be readable by typical poll workers.
Right, but it doesn't need to be audible, for example.
No.
Or audible.
That's not
Okay.
the view, and I don't believe, but I don't have legal expertise that there's any legal requirement to provide that.
It would be an ADA issue on the election official side, since they're all going to be public. It'd be a a question of a reasonable accommodation. Can the poll worker do the essential functions of the job of poll worker? Anyway, you know, yeah, so there are provisions for that, and the expectation would be that if there's a way to make an accommodation and or add on assistive technology to do that, then, you know, yeah, but that would be taken care of outside of these standards. That's gonna be an ADA implementation issue on the election official side.
I simply bring it up because it is set up in that statement as equivalent and can be taken as such.
Yeah, so it's just measurement. So I guess we weren't clear. Most of this is for the voter. Do we need to make this clear that also for anything the poll worker sees, it's got to be usable? You know, we didn't make this distinction in the guidelines. You know, I'm okay with that, but it's going to be how the requirements are written, and yeah.
This is going to inform the requirements, and so depending on how people want to interpret what we write here.
Yeah, we didn't
that's
specifically
important.
say which part, everything should be usable, which parts are accessible.
Right, because
So-
for the voter, we have to change for every voter. And we have to reset for every voter. Are we resetting for every poll worker? What do we, it can get, if one poll worker needs high contrast, but the other one doesn't, how do we create the easy? There's a lot that could go sideways.
And then it's getting, in my opinion, way too complex to get a good system
Right.
put together. We could add to the wording representative voters for both usability and accessibility, and poll workers for usability. I'm on the fly, I hate to wordsmith, so, but that might be one way to make that clear.
So
if
McDermott,
you
what I'm
feel
hearing
not
is
clear
that maybe we should break it out, and, or no?
enough. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that might be a wise decision, but I will,
So
I'm
it
just
could be
bringing up
done,
the point.
yeah, it could be, well, we'll come back and revisit these, you know, at the end, but I've noted it, and, you know, certainly it could be solved in a number of ways, either by wordsmithing that current guideline or creating two separate guidelines,
Lori?
or whatever makes the most
I,
sense.
I would recommend, this is Lori Gino, I would recommend that we strike, point taken, that we strike poll workers in that third bullet, because we do address the ease of use in Principle 1, high-quality design.
Yeah, we don't call out poll workers specifically. So, well, in the third bullet, we want to test, and we actually have a protocol for poll worker usability testing, and there is specific requirements covering this in the VVSG 1.1. So I have to think, where would we put those requirements for poll workers then?
So Lori, just for
Yeah.
reference, Lori's referencing principle number 2, high quality implementation. The voting system is implemented using high quality best practices. 2.2, the voting system is implemented using best practice user-centered design methods for a wide range of representative voters and poll workers, including those with and without disabilities. So I think Lori's suggestion, correct me if I'm wrong, is 2.2 covers.
It doesn't cover the, so this last bullet was the summative usability test. It only covers the user-centered design process, although if you do a good user-centered design process, you will, in principle, be usable for poll workers. So I see that this adds a little extra in terms of an end-user test for poll workers measuring effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction.
So I'm just thinking in terms of, this is Lori Gino, in the desire to keep these reduced rather than create more principles, and to ensure that we're somewhat concise. Are we being redundant by having it in the robust, safe, usable, and accessible, as well as the high-quality implementation? And is there a way that we can pull in that
Yeah,
component
it's getting
into
at two slightly different ways of testing. One is in your design process, you count for poll workers. In this particular guideline, it's calling out doing this test at the end.
So I think, this is Mary Brady, why don't we table it until after we discuss the high-quality implementation? And then,
Yep.
you know, and then we can revisit it.
Okay, so that actually goes to my next point to transition to the next slide. This last guideline that we've been discussing is actually based on what's currently in VVSG 1.1. However, if you haven't designed with your users in mind from the beginning, doing a test at the end is like forgetting the flour in your cake and trying to add it in when the cake's already baked. So that's why under high quality implementation, which Ben will be talking about, we added a guideline that says that best practice user-centered design methods for a wide range of representative voters and poll workers is implemented, including those with and without disabilities. And since we first wrote these requirements, actually starting in 1.1 for the ones you just saw, there's now a whole family of reporting formats, not just the one for summative usability testing, but for user-centered design methods, reflecting best practice. So there's a lot of tools and guidance out there now for this. And really, if you do your user-centered design properly in your development, everything should fall out at the end. And it's not a full-blown, lots of different representative users in a user-centered design methodology. You typically start off with checklists, perhaps. You may start out with expert users who know a lot about accessibility. You might add a few people who are expert with a disability, looking for problems so you can fix them in your design. Presumably you're iterating through your design. So a lot of these user-centered design methods are relatively low cost and part of best practice across the IT industry.
I think that's a great point, Sharon. And I think, maybe there are some resources that we should make available, as immediately to the implementation and testing group. So you have ready access to these resources.
Right, and I think it also needs to be, the labs need to be part of that discussion, because it is entirely possible that the experts and these user testing designs will come up with a recommendation that is then somehow in conflict with the judgment of the labs as how they interpret the standard. So making sure that that does not occur is a very important, because I don't want to get feedback from one side and then say, you don't pass the requirement on the other.
Judd?
And that,
Oh, sorry.
that could happen.
Judd?
Would you mind going back to the last slide? So one issue, and I know it's a term of art, but the use of the word users in the principle, do you mean voters? Or should we be using the word voters instead of users? So accessible experience for all voters instead of users?
We could edit that. Was covering, poll workers and voters.
Seems like that would be a harder thing to test to if we were that broad.
Principles were kind of more generic, so that's why we used the word, but I mean, I don't think it necessarily hurts to be a little more specific. I'm trying to think, are there other, well, election officials, I suppose, could be other users, and if you're going to look at software for setting up the ballot, et cetera, you'd want, those aren't poll workers, there are other users. I'll let some of our election officials chime in perhaps on this. Depends on the scope of what you're applying some of these to, but.
This is Lori Agino. I think the intent of this was to roll up robust, safe, usable, and accessible to capture all of those people that, all of us that might be using the system.
Yeah.
And I think we've identified that challenge is some of those principles will apply to voters, some will apply to election officials, some could apply to a poll worker, could apply to the public in general. So therein lies, I think, the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we don't want a system that is harmful to election officials. Although some may want a system that is harmful to election officials, right? And so that's why it says users, right? But your point's well taken, so we can cover that. But I think that was the point of the higher level principle, saying all users that way, including the poll workers too. You want it safe for poll workers too, which would call into question how heavy the systems are, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah, and I've been doing the same thing. I've been trying to figure out, okay, is this merge it over here or split it apart? And the challenge, quite frankly, is the accessible piece. The robust, safe, and usable, I think you're okay at a user level, and whether that's election officials or poll workers or whomever. The problem is there's a different legal standard for accessibility when you're talking about a voter directly interacting with and marking, verifying, and casting a ballot than everybody else interacting, and there's a different level of actually a different legal requirement, period. And that's where the challenge is. And I was thinking, okay, do you pull accessible out of the stem? And I don't, but that's the challenge. Is it implying that then the VVSG is gonna have a whole set of accessibility standards for people beyond voters, which it's not, so.
And I
Yeah.
think, this is Bob Giles, I think my concern with that is because in 8.2, you say the voting system meets currently acceptable federal standards for accessibility, and if we're gonna try to apply that to board workers and election officials, I think that's where it starts, somebody could make that leap and say, well, you said the federal standards, so that means everybody who touches the system. I think that's where we need to be clear.
Yeah, and that's actually referencing, general web accessibility standards or general document accessibility, not the actual voting system. So yeah, somehow there's some clarification we gotta work on, but anyway.
Yeah, I hate to pull out accessible completely, right? Because it can be accessible, not usable by people that need the accessibility. So it's hard to pull apart. And it's,
We can revisit it this afternoon. We'll
Yeah.
take a look. All of us could take a look
Yeah.
at a proposed change if necessary.
might
ahead.
be able to do it by rejiggering the guidelines underneath it, to be more specific.
Yep.
That might be the most elegant way to do it. Okay, before I talk about privacy, when we pull these together, our security folks and the human factors folks said, well, if we've got overlap with ballot secrecy and privacy, and we really need, and we don't, so I said, well, okay, what's our definition? And we didn't even have a working definition of what we mean by privacy and ballot secrecy. So in order to pull these notions apart and really understand them, to make sure we don't have redundancy, but we're covering everything we need to cover, we have a working definition of privacy and ballot secrecy. So we make a distinction between the privacy of the interaction between the voter, that is, if you're at the voting system as you want a privacy screen, you don't want your vote announced, your choices announced out loud. You want to be able to mark it independently so you have your privacy. But there's also the secrecy once the ballot has been marked, to keep that ballot and secret from who, so that no one can determine how a specific voter marked their ballot. So our working definition is that voter privacy is primarily concerned with what happens while a voter is marking and casting their ballot, right? So they can mark it without revealing their ballot selections. And also, a voting system should not record how a specific voter interacted with the ballot. So often we don't have too many folks using the accessible system, so you don't want to mark, audio was used, it's clear the audio was used. We only had one blind voter this morning, so you can reveal their vote. Ballot secrecy is primarily concerned with what happens after a voter casts their ballot. So the voting system must not create or store any link between a specific voter's identity and a set of specific ballot selections. So with that intro, I'm going to talk about privacy, the privacy principle, and then our security folks, I believe Josh and Gemma, will talk about the ballot secrecy principle. So voter privacy is that voters can mark their ballot and verify and cast their vote selections privately and independently. So that means that the voting process preserves that privacy of the voter's interaction with the ballot, the modes of voting, and the vote selections. And the voter can mark their ballot and verify and cast their vote selections and other associated cast vote record without assistance from others. That's this whole independence criteria as called out in HAVA. So, are there any questions about this? So we found that the definition useful in making these distinctions and where to place the different requirements underneath it.
Lori?
On our copy that we have in front of us, I think this one was the one that was in the packet, there's a punctuation, some funky punctuation happening.
We didn't hire you
Yeah.
to be a proofreader, Lori.
There were two sets of
However-
typos. There's, so the comma situation, so what I put down here was my correction of the typo.
Right, punctuation, not proofreading, but punctuation could lead to a different
Yes, gotcha.
definition of
Go for
it.
principle.
Go for it.
It was corrected on my slide, if you're happy with that correction.
So we need to update the document to reflect Sharon's slide. Got it. Done. Thank you, Lori.
This is Greg Riddlemoser. The first bullet, third word, very seldom in here do we talk about anything other than voting systems. And not to quibble, but voting process obviously can be argued to be everything from voter registration all the way through to the sticker lady and the 364 days that happened in between. So my recommendation, and not to wordsmith this, because building PowerPoints by committee or speech writing or this with lots of people involved gets real cumbersome real quick, but I think that this is a distinction that needs to be made.
I do think that the principle limits it to the marking, verifying, casting. So the sub-bullet guideline, I think, inherits that, but it's the process of how the voting system can be set up to preserve the privacy. So that's my view of how it's scoped.
Good. Anyone else?
Okay, I've already talked about a little bit about transparency and the user-centered design process that you'll hear in other talks. So that concludes the human factors portion. Any final questions? And I do really have to give big kudos to the public working group. They really have been amazing.
Quick question. Why did you choose the words voter secret or ballot secrecy rather than ballot anonymity? Because the contents of the ballot are actually not secret once they have left the voter's hands, as long as it's not traced back to the voter.
Okay, so I was searching for definitions, and it seems that voter privacy and ballot secrecy are kind of used interchangeably, and those seem to be what the terms are, and there's various definitions floating around. And I didn't see, nor did our security folks see that term specifically at the high definitional level. So,
Victor, this applies to ballot secrecy?
Yes.
Then we'll
Yeah.
come back to it after lunch.
Yeah.
And I'll make note of it in the notes for the ballot secrecy principle.
Yeah, and
I mean, I could see that going into that anonymity being used at the requirements level for certain.
I think part of it was to, not to take Sharon's words, but a use of plain language to try to make it understandable and consistent with other language out there. But we'll explore it with the security folks this afternoon. Good. Sharon, I want to thank you, and I know I've done this at a prior meeting. You and Diane and your working group led this charge on this VVSG 2.0. You all kind of set the pace out in front with the amount of work, and you continue to with your requirements work, and it's very much appreciated. You all have been leaders in setting the pace and work, and so
I have to recognize the team behind us,
It-
though.
well,
It's been
yeah.
phenomenal.
Yeah, the entire team and the work from Center for Civic Design, obviously helping drive this as well. But you all did yeoman's work and really kind of shamed the other working groups into pushing forward. So
No, we inspired them.
yeah, inspired. That's what it is, inspired. Okay, Sharon, thank you. Again, the process, so that we understand it, we'll go through the other ones. We'll continue to take notes on your suggested, and then we'll revisit them all this afternoon. So anyone that thought this meeting wouldn't be a grind is kidding themselves, but that's exactly what we're here to do. It is lunchtime. So we will break for an hour, which will bring us back at 1:15, 1:20.